Thank you so much for coming in this horrible weather. It's great to see so many people that I know and love. The book tour is like a wedding in that way. It gathers all of the people that you love in one place, and that's great. I thought I would start by reading a little bit. I find readings boring, and I think that people should just read the book, which is the way it's intended to be consumed. But whatever. This is the genre we're working in, the reading. All right, I'm just going to read the very beginning of the book, so it should make sense. All things are too small, begins a poem by the 13th century Dutch mystic Hedwig of Brabant. She goes on to hold me, but she did not have to. All things are too small, not just to hold me, but to hold anything. Cups are too small, which is why they demand such relentless refilling. Bodies are too small to encompass more than a sole inhabitant, except in rare cases of mysticism or possession, or the more familiar but perhaps no less astounding case of pregnancy. Books can be big, most of the best ones are, but even the most encyclopedic affairs are too small to encompass the whole of the world's wild machinery. Moby Dick can't reach its arms around a whale, although Melville Ames, as James Wood writes, to touch every last word. I once saw a man in a restaurant finish his pasta, order the same dish again, eat it, then order and finish it a third time. His was the sanest response to his predicament, but he wouldn't have had to grasp at such exorbitance if any plate available were big enough.
That was short.
I just feel like people go on and on reading, and that's not why you come to hear an author talk.
Yeah, that was short. Becca, it's a delight to be with you this evening. And I would like to begin, if I may, with a very soft introductory sort of question. I see a number of my students in the room studying the essay. Quite a lot of them come to me, have done over the years, and say, how did you get into reviewing? And the truth is that how I got into reviewing in the 1980s, into freelance book reviewing, is not especially applicable now. But you really are a living, right here embodiment of a kind of academic and journalistic interplay that is really appealing to lots and lots of aspirant writers and lots of students and so on. So could I just ask you, first of all, how you got into what that movement has been in your life and how you currently hold it together?
Yes. First of all, I consider you living too. So I
am still alive.
You're a good example.
Yeah.
I got into book reviewing because I wanted to go to graduate school and get a PhD. I thought that was the only way that you could read and write and think for a living. All of my professors said, don't do it. You're not going to get a job. But if you have to do it, wait for a year and do something else first so that you're not just continuously in school from the ages of like 18 to 30. So I said, okay. And there was an opening at a magazine called The New Republic. So I got a job there, and I was introduced to a kind of writing that I had not known existed, which was sort of long form literary criticism or essays for the public that were rigorously intellectual. And I realized that this is, in my view, maybe the best form of writing because it's fun to write, it's fun to read. I don't think it has to sacrifice any of the rigor of academic scholarship. I did go to graduate school, and many of my advisors are in the audience tonight, but I was often a subpar graduate student, often writing book reviews, often off writing book reviews, and I just kept writing book reviews. I thought it was a bad thing to be doing because I was like, I should be focusing on my PhD, but it was a compulsion. And that ended up working out for me because I ended up getting a job at the Washington Post, and that is how I'm here today.
But so while you were here still at Harvard, I mean, you are still at Harvard, but when you were, this is all getting quite philosophical, but when you were a student, when you were physically here in Cambridge, let's say a few years ago, how was that? What was the, you were writing a lot of reviews, fiction reviews, essentially anything that came your way. You were voracious for reviewing. Did the academic work just take a back seat for a while? I mean, how does it?
It's not nice to ask me this in front of my professors. I mean, I would like to think that I fulfilled the requirements of my PhD program reasonably decently. Nobody seemed especially dissatisfied, and I ended up being ABD, although I must confess, I have not done my logic requirement. So I maybe shouldn't be ABD, actually. But I did spend more of my time reading more widely than I think I would have if I had decided that I wanted to aggressively pursue a job in academia. Sometimes reading philosophy, but reading philosophy that had nothing to do with the stuff that I was working on. And I did spend a lot of my time book reviewing. I mean, more than I thought was prudent because.
Well, that would be my next question, because obviously it's quite easy as a literature teacher to move from there to reviewing fiction, right? It's essentially, the pedagogy of the classroom is much like the pedagogy of the review. It might be a little different if you're doing philosophy with one part of your brain, perhaps, and then writing a fiction review for the TLS with the other, right? What kind of philosophy were you or are you doing as in your thesis?
Well, I've come to accept that philosophy and literature should be more closely entwined, I think, than they are. And the philosophy that I think is best or that I most enjoy reading, I think, has a claim to being classified as literature. People like Stanley Cavell, people like Augustine. The unfortunate reality is that a lot of scholarship in philosophy departments these days is maybe not beautifully written, to put it mildly and charitably. So I guess I thought initially that I was leading the schizophrenic existence, where I was getting to do this one kind of thing with my brain that I enjoyed in one domain, which was kind of chopping up arguments and reassembling them, and this other thing that I enjoyed with this other part of my brain. I was actually choosing between complet and philosophy PhD programs. So allowing myself to write book reviews was my sort of consolation prize to myself. Not consolation prize, because philosophy is great, king among the academic disciplines and all that, but yes, it was my way of keeping in touch with literary stuff. And I thought I was doing totally different things until I began to see that philosophy could be more literary.
Yeah. I mean, you've written, not in the book, but you've written, I know, for, I think, Oxford Public Philosophy, about precisely this question of whether there should be any meaningful division between academic philosophy and public philosophy. And in your opinion, there really shouldn't, in the sense that one is the other. But again, I mean, if you look at literature departments in the last 10 or 20 years, there's been a marked movement towards a sort of public-facing criticism, which I approve of. I mean, I like that, obviously. I would, wouldn't I? But less of that in philosophy still?
I think philosophy is beginning to take slightly more of a public turn, or at least no one at Harvard has ever seemed hostile to these kind of pursuits. And I'm not just saying that because they're here. I chose the department in part because they seemed welcoming of this humanistic approach to intellectual life. But I do think that more and more philosophers are writing public-facing work, and it's becoming more acceptable. It's no longer seen as a mark of frivolity. That might be true just across the humanities, as we desperately fight for our existence and desperately fight to demonstrate our relevance at every turn.
And is it still, I mean, institutionally speaking, it would still be hard to make a career in a sort of Stanley Cavell-like way, doing the sort of work he did?
Regrettably, that is my view. I mean, there are people in the audience who maybe know more about this than I do, who maybe could weigh in. If Dick Moran can say if he thinks you could be Stanley Cavell at the end of this. But no, I think that not really. That's not really the way to get an academic paper published, is my sense. And I think that's regrettable. And there were people who were not literary in the same way, people like Thomas Nagel, but who did write beautifully with this really distinctive style that was all their own. And you don't really see papers like that very much anymore, which I think is unfortunate. Of course, there are some, but.
Yeah. The book is fantastic, and we should, I mean, I want to dig into it.
Let's dig in.
So let's dig in. It's a book about lots of different pleasures that in some way defy the disciplines of control, where disciplines of control and order, and in other ways also defy what Rawls called the difference principle, right? That defy or confound or seem to complicate straightforward questions of injustice, egalitarianism, and so on. I think you write, justice is a virtue of social systems, but not necessarily a virtue of other sorts of things. So maybe you just, if you wouldn't mind, just pick one or two of those other sorts of things that you write so beautifully about, and would you mind just sort of talking about how they are not necessarily compatible with strict ideas of egalitarianism or justice?
Yes, I think that hierarchy should prevail in the domain of love. I mean, I think love is defined by preferring one person to other people. And so I think it's an intrinsically hierarchical endeavor. One can have a different kind of love, agape, the kind of love that Jesus bears towards everybody, but that doesn't seem like the only kind of love that humans ought to have. So that's one domain in which I think hierarchy is good. The other, perhaps more controversially, is in the arts. I don't think that we should adjudge all artworks to be equally good. I don't think that we should, out of a sense of niceness or politeness, say that we think that Marvel movies, for example, are good movies. That's, by this point, a cliched example. I think everybody is comfortable now trashing Marvel movies, but I think that we should be comfortable being harsh and honest in our assessments of artworks that are bad. And I think that all of this will strike us as less dangerous and horrifying against a backdrop of economic and political egalitarianism. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the arguments that runs throughout the book, is that economic and political egalitarianism would allow us to have hierarchy safely in these other domains where it belongs.
Yeah. So let's make a list of these, of the things that keep on reappearing in the book. Love, sex, aesthetics, appetite, the body. These are all.
That's an incomplete list.
It is an incomplete list. But interior decor.
Interior
you can add that to your list.
Marie Kondo.
Thank you. But these are all ways of being alive that it's not. It seems to me that what you're interested in is not just the ways in which they refuse to be disciplined. It's also some ecstatic surplus that makes them uncontainable, and that therefore that all these things are still dangerous, wonderfully dangerous, and you like writing around that and in that area.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, I think I define maximalism more as gratuitousness than I do just as a largeness. And so all of these things, well, maybe not all of them, but yes, I think all of the things that you just listed, I'm a proponent of having more of them, more sex, more love, more aesthetics, more appetites, and maybe not more of the body. I don't know how that fits in. That's the last item on the list, but more of those things than you need to survive.
Yeah.
The book is sort of anti-utilitarian, not in the technical philosophical sense, but anti the idea that we should only have things that we need in order to subsist. And it's pro the idea that we should have more than we need because our humanity consists in these things that are more than we need to just keep our bodies going.
Yeah. Well, if we take, for instance, you have a tremendous essay about sex post-consent, right? If we take that as we could just spend a minute on that, if that's okay.
That's
right?
All right.
Okay, so
what would you do if I were like, no, it's not all right?
Well, it wouldn't be post-consent then, would it? I would have to retreat like a good boy and go home. And
I do consent.
Thank you so much.
Now we're after
thank you so much.
We can proceed.
All right. Okay, so you look at a number of writers. Let's just start there. You look at a number of writers, philosophers, but also pundits who are dealing with a sort of post-Me Too sexual environment. Would you mind just laying out what they talk about and what you, by and large, don't care for in their critiques?
Yeah, so I guess I can begin with what I do like about their critiques. A lot of these people on both the left and the right, and I can name names at a later time, think that consent is not enough. It's not sufficient to provide an account of morally good sex, much less pleasurable sex. And that the locus of sexual ethics and discussions about sexual ethics for a long time has just been whether the consent standard has been satisfied. Whereas we should be asking a much bigger question about what good sex looks like, or how good sex fits into the good life more broadly. I think everybody agrees, thankfully, that consent is a necessary condition for good sex, but I think a lot of people think that it's not a sufficient condition for good sex. So we agree about that. But then there's disagreements about what a fuller account of good sex might be like. And I isolate two strains in, I guess, post-consent thinking. One is a right-wing strain, kind of reactionary strain that questions the wisdom of the sexual revolution, according to which basically sex is for something else. Yeah. It's an expression of love, or it's a means to the end of procreation. It's never something to be valued in its own right. It's never basically an aesthetic enterprise.
Yes.
And then there's a kind of the mirror image of this view, which is less noxious, but I think still wrong, is the leftist idea that sex is a means to the end of political purification or revolution or something like that.
And who are the two people you would put on in those camps?
I think Amiya Srinivasan is probably the main person in the latter camp. And there's two novels that I discuss, Little Rabbit and Acts of Service, two recent novels where the characters grapple with this, and they articulate how pervasive this idea of sexual ethics has become on the left. Both of them are bi, but they feel that they should be lesbian because they feel that that's like politically better, and they resist their attraction to these kind of problematic, in the lingo of the era, sexual partners. And then on the other side, the two people that I target are Christine Emba, who was my colleague at the Washington Post but is now at the Atlantic, and Louise Perry, who is, I think, just a free-floating reactionary.
Yeah. They exist. Yeah.
They both wrote books that are, they basically wrote the identical book, which is fascinating. Almost all of the chapters have kind of the same name, but Louise Perry, because she's openly reactionary, the book is called like The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, whereas Christine Emba's book has some kind of polite title, and then all the chapters are questions. Instead of being like, you could only have good sex in marriage, she's like, can you only have good sex in marriage?
And then you work through the what you don't like about those various critiques, and then you modestly propose and immodestly propose how you think sex should be written about. I was going to say how sex should be defended, but that already sounds too instrumental in a way. It's like how you want to think about sex. So just lay that out if you wouldn't mind.
Not at all. I defend in this essay and also in another essay earlier in the book, or actually I don't remember if it's earlier or later in the book, but about David Cronenberg, that I think that sex is transformative, or I think that it should be transformative. Like, I think the erotic consists in a willingness to be surprised and shocked and altered by an encounter with someone who's truly other than the self. And so I don't think that there needs to be any end beyond an erotic encounter that is properly erotic in this sense. It's enough to have an encounter with somebody who transforms you in some way, even if you're not in love with that person, even if you don't get married to that person. Although one of the transformative sex essays about my husband, yes, I don't think that sex needs to be for more than that, for more than the surprise of another person. And I do think that this can have salutary political effects. It can lead to the reversal of hierarchies, because love and sex lead to such tumultuous welter of emotions. Even people who are powerful in some domains can be totally disempowered or even rendered abject by the intensity of their affection. And so that's one way in which it can have political consequences, but it shouldn't be for the political consequences that it has.
Yeah. And I think you liken it to play, and you talk about how play doesn't need to defend itself as anything more than play. Play simply is. It has no, it's very hard for evolutionary psychologists to make any sense of it. It just is. We like to play. We like to have sex, right? I mean, that's it.
Yes, and there's a really good book that actually was recommended to me by my friend Charlie right here, called Homo Ludens by Huizinga, whose name I might be saying wrong, which is a delightful defense of play and history of play for its own sake.
Right.
And he says that it has confounded people who try to understand why animals play, why people play, why most species play. No one can assign a utilitarian function to it because, in fact, it is for nothing. It is an aesthetic activity. which isn't to say that it's an insignificant activity, just that it's not for anything beyond itself.
Yeah. And again, I'm just going to list the things that you were talking about in relation to sex. What I really like is you start by saying desire is desire is desire, and whatever it is, it's ours, right? It doesn't do any good to sort of disown it, to sort of say, well, this part of desire isn't really how we are. It is. It's all, in that sense, everything is human. It's ours. You like the illegibility of eros, right? Beautifully say something about how our encounters with other people can be that we're cracked open like eggs. Then you go on to say, I love this thing. You go on to say that it isn't like sex isn't like going to a dinner party where you know that you're the guest and you bring a bottle of wine and the wine will be opened. It's more like going to the dinner party and you suddenly become the cutlery or maybe the meat on the table, right? It's all up for grabs.
Maybe this is an indictment of dinner parties because they could be arranged.
They could be like that. And then you go on to this very interesting thing where you go on. And this is what I want to ask you about. You go from there to saying that there's no necessary rivalry between beauty and goodness in a work of art. If we simply say about an artwork that it is good when it's beautiful, and you go on to say that aesthetic success can easily be thought of as is moral success. What's the movement from talking about sex to talking about the union of beauty and goodness there? And this isn't sort of, I'm not trying to interrogate you, I'm just interested in the movement of the essay.
Yes. I probably can't say everything that I've thought about this subject. I've thought about it a lot. Some here will remember that my second year paper was about this subject, published now in the British Journal of Aesthetics, about how sometimes ethical value depends on aesthetic value rather than the inverse. But the more interesting way to say that in the context of this essay is that sex that is good as in pleasurable, as in aesthetically good in the context of this essay, is also morally good, because what makes it pleasurable is that you allow yourself to be shocked and confronted and jolted and transformed and utterly surprised by another person and their effects on you. That is what makes it aesthetically good, and that's also what makes it morally good, because that's the way to take stock of the individuality of another person, in my view. And there's a line from Iris Murdoch that I quote in the book that I may totally mess up, but it's something like, love is the very difficult realization that something other than the self exists. And so I think that is both the ethical and the aesthetic merit of a good erotic encounter. And that is why those two, the aesthetic and the ethical, are connected in this sphere.
Yeah, you write very nicely about that in the essay on waiting. More about love than necessarily about sex, but essentially you're talking about how, and there's quite a lot of you're moving through Roland Barthes too, but you talk about how to love someone else and to open oneself up to someone else is, in a sense, to hear your channeling Barthes, is to open oneself up to the inevitable absence of the other, right? The person's present, but insofar as that person can't be you and you can't ever merge with that person, however dearly you love that person's also absent in a way. Just talk a little bit in the vein of that, but also following on from the Murdoch thing about the extremely difficult realization that something other than oneself is real. Just talk a little bit about that, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, I suppose this book is about a series of attempts to grasp things that are fundamentally ungraspable or that are too large to grasp. And so one of them is just any other person. Like, you can never consume another person as fully as you might want to. Some part of them always exceeds your grasp. And that's also true, I think, of artworks. There's an essay in the book about Simone Weil, the mystic, who has this beautiful passage about attempts to eat beauty, which I first read in a class taught by Elaine Scarry, who I believe is also here tonight. Thank you, Elaine. but you can eat beauty. And so this passage is like, well, we have to find something to do with beauty, some way to bear it, given that we can't actually consume it.
Yeah.
And so then we do all these other things to it. She doesn't say this, I say this. We do criticism about it, because that's the closest we can come to like eating and digesting beauty or something like that. I don't remember how I got there from where I started talking.
Let's talk about the thing of eating beauty, because that was an amazing essay, and it's you at your most religious, because I think really you're secretly very religious.
I would like to be a medieval mystic.
Yes,
there's no secret about that.
So for the audience who haven't, members of the audience who haven't read the book yet or read this particular essay, it's called
I think it's called
Having a Cake and Eating It Too. Okay, so the Simone Weil passage is an incredible one about, yes, attempting to eat beauty. And she says, maybe Eve's sin was that she attempted to eat beauty, and maybe all crime, right? Crimes of passion and so on, vice, come from this desire to eat beauty, and that maybe the rectitudinous, the religious correction of that, the right thing to do, would be to somehow look at the fruit without eating it. You then make a lovely switch where you say, well, looking at it can be eating it too. We don't necessarily need to make that division. You talk a little bit about beauty inspiring surrender. Talk about George Herbert's poem Love, with its famous last line, so I did sit and eat. And then you begin to talk about heaven through George Herbert. And there's quite a lot of allusion here. There's George Herbert, there's Hedovich of Brabant, who said about Christ, he eats us, we think we eat him. This is an incredible, I knew nothing about her, so this is phenomenal. He eats us, we think we eat him, and we do eat him. Of this we can be certain, but he remains so undevoured, is what she said about our relation to Christ. Then there's Rashi on Exodus, who says, in heaven there won't be any appetite, there won't be any hunger or thirst, but at the same time we will have all the food and drink that we want. And this really, really interests you, doesn't it? This really gets you, is some heavenly state where precisely one would be able to have one's cake and eat it, when one would be eating beauty, where, as it were, there would be a kind of hunger without satiation, right? There would be, what is that for you? What? Because you go on then to say, is this literal? I don't need to believe in heaven.
What is that for me? I guess it is a construct that gets me through my life and helps me understand my own relationship to works of art that I love, and my sense that there's some action I wish I could take towards them, but I can't really think of what that action would be, other than reading them and writing about them, and yet that still never seems to be enough. So I imagine some world where I can partake of something like a book, which you can't eat as fully as I wish you could, immerse yourself in it somehow. And that's, do I actually believe that there is a heaven? Probably not, unfortunately, but I think it's a helpful construct. It helps us understand what paradise would be for us. And that is what paradise would be for me, being able to eat beauty without the beauty depreciating too. Because in normal cases of eating, the thing that you eat, first your appetites are sated and the thing that you eat depreciates. One of the good things about art is that it doesn't depreciate most of it. Books, other kinds of permanent art, they remain. We can't destroy them through our appetites, but perhaps that's why we also cannot satisfy ourselves with them wholly.
And you wouldn't, but in some paradoxical way, you'd be perpetually hungry and perpetually sated in this.
Yes, that heaven. Is precisely my idea of heaven. And I think that Hedovich shares that. There's lots of other like crazy lines. Crazy is the wrong word. There's lots of other beautiful lines in Hedovich's poetry about satiation and hunger.
I was selfishly, kind of personally very interested in this, because I feel part of my extremely Christian inheritance is that I'm always I'm always moving between sort of appetite and control, and the one is always in relation to the other. The one is judging the other. The one is an escape from the other, or a verdict on the other. And so there's always a sort of either or for me between the ethical and the aesthetic. And I guess I just sort of live with that as just, you know. But I feel in some way that what's interesting about you is that there isn't necessarily a sort of judgmental swerve between one or the other. It just, you can hold it together, and maybe it's just the category of beauty holds it together for you. I really felt that reading the book.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, maybe Jews have less of a hang-up about this,
I hope
although
so.
more hang-ups about everything else. As patron saint of the Jews, Philip Roth once said, let's put the id back in yid. So.
He did, and also said, fuck the laudable ideologies, as you might remember in Savage Theatre. Yeah.
I guess that's my philosophy.
So you're not, the thing I was talking about, the sort of either the Kierkegaardian, you know, aesthetic, ethical, whatever, or just more broadly a kind of either or between pleasurable but slightly guilty appetite, and then the recoil from that, which is the control of it, and the retreat back into control, which can be either at the level of food or sex or writing, whatever it is, right? That's not some that I'm not describing. I mean, apart from describing a general human dimension, I'm not describing something specific to you in that regard.
This is maybe the one way in which I am not neurotic. The single way in which I'm not neurotic is that I don't feel guilt about the consumption of beauty. And my academic work too, such as it was an attempt to think about the ways in which ethics and aesthetics sit together, influence each other. And so via reading lots of different proposals for how they might, it no longer seems even strange to me to think that there's not some kind of absolute dichotomy between them, that of course they influence each other.
Mm-hmm.
Of course a book is aesthetically improved, like to the extent that it's humane, or of course a book's humanity is enhanced to the extent that it's aesthetically sensitive.
Yeah.
These are the examples that I use in my one published papers, like Madame Bovary, the best book ever, possibly. If the writing were uglier or less sensitive or less lyrical, it could easily be garish, sensationalist, maybe even sexist. Like the events depicted in the book lend themselves to that kind of aesthetic treatment. It's only because the book is so good aesthetically that it can be so good morally, I think.
And you don't, because this is where my little monitor comes in, and you're not going then to read Flaubert and say, but it's too beautiful. That's the problem.
There's no chance. There's no chance of that. You're safe with me.
Actually, you're not safe with me, because I think sometimes it is too beautiful.
No, it's not. It's not.
Well, anyway.
Temptations of St. Anthony is far too beautiful. But
yes,
not,
it is.
Not
yeah,
yet
absolutely.
Madame Bovary.
Yes, as we know. What was the one he read out over 2 days to his
I think it is the
friends,
Temptations of St. Anthony.
And then they said, Gustave, we can't take this. Write about just take an ordinary subject, an adulterous woman. And he did. Well, we're a little bit early, but